Spring practice updates from a third of the way through spring camp. Young receivers turning heads, but the question remains, is the offensive line going to be good enough for South Carolina to compete for a college football playoff, or will it keep them out altogether? Locked On Gamecock starts right now.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, guys? Welcome into Locked On Gamecocks. I'm your host, Chris Marler, and we have another wonderful episode for you today. And thank you for making Locked On Gamecocks your first listen each and every day. Shout out to our everydayers. Remember, we're a free and available podcast wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, today's episode, we're going to get into a little bit of spring camp. I know we've talked a lot about the women's team. We're going to preview their game against Maryland tomorrow and the games they have ahead this weekend to try to advance to another Final Four. We're also going to still talk about the transfer portal in basketball. There's over 1,200 players that have entered their name in the portal so far. Who is South Carolina potentially targeting? But today I want to get back to basics and talk about football because spring camp has been underway for the last couple of weeks in Columbia. And there's some great news, some good news and some great news as we head towards the spring game. Now, here's the stuff that I keep seeing, and it's kind of what you expected from the early parts of camp, and that is receivers, the young ones that are like the five guys you signed in this past cycle, they look as advertised, they look legit. The other receivers you have coming back from last year, Jared Brown, Mazeo Bennett, obviously Nick Harbor, they all continue to take very important next steps in developing into being even better than they were a year ago. I've talked about it nonstop with Nick Harbor, and I think that the fact that he is going to be available in the facility, not even like the practices are great, but just being in the facility, being able to watch film, also being in a room full of better athletes. Like that kid is used to being the best athlete on any field, track, or wherever he steps into every time he does it. He's still the best athlete on the team and one of the best in the country, but he's got a lot of talent around him to kind of raise the floor of how good they can be. So competition always brings the cream always rises to the top, as my grandpa would always say. The question I have is this. There's some great reviews from the freshmen and younger guys at receiver, and we're going to talk about that. But the two biggest concerns we had going into fall and really spring were, how does the offensive line improve, and the interior defensive line and or the linebackers. Those are your biggest areas of concern. And part of it is because, it's not because you have like a lack of talent there. You just have a lack of unproven talent there because of how much you're losing to the NFL draft. One of the things I get nervous about with this team going forward is I think this year's draft class from South Carolina is going to break program records and be something that the fans, the team, obviously the program itself, coaches, all that kind of stuff can take a lot of pride in, and also use as a recruiting pitch down the line moving forward. Like, look at what we've been able to develop here. We are able to put kids in the league, and we're able to do it at a really high and rapid pace. But losing that level of talent means you got to replace it. And those specific positions are not easy, especially when you don't have a ton of experience. I like what South Carolina has in the roster. I love what they went and got in the portal. But here's the question I have. If the receivers are great, which I think they will be, if they are great and they have one of the best quarterbacks, not only in the conference but in the country throwing to them, that is obviously a recipe for success. I think Josiah Thompson is going to be one of the better left tackles going into year two that's in the SEC, especially with the talent lost at that position around the league. He would have to make a big jump from year one to year two. That's obvious. But you're talking about a offensive line that over the last 2 years gave up a combined 82 sacks. 82 sacks over the last 2 years. And maybe we're setting the bar a little too high in terms of the comparison or where you should expect this team to be. But I'm going to start it there and talk about the numbers of the offensive line of previous national champions have put up and the one thing they all have in common. Again, South Carolina gave up 41 sacks this year with one of the best dual threat quarterbacks in the country. 41 this year, 41 last year. In 25 total games, you have 82. There's not a national champion in the last 5 seasons that has won a title and allowed more than 20 total sacks in a season. Now, we have seen teams that have not had the best offensive lines. Alabama comes to mind. And they still make the playoff. That 2021 team that ended up going to the national championship, they allowed, I think it was like a program record at the time, like 41 or 43 sacks that year. The following year in 2023, they allowed 49, which was more, I think, than Georgia, Washington, Oregon, and Michigan combined. I mean, like that's crazy. There's so much offensive success that this team will certainly have this year. So much. Lenore Sellers is one of the best quarterbacks in the country. I love all of the not really rumors, but like all of the reports early on about his supporting cast, because last year it took a while to get it going. I mean, even Harbor had a great season, but he especially came on late, right? Like you look at some of Harbor's numbers in the first part of the year, where I think on the season he finishes, let me pull it up here. On the season, he finishes with around 376. There we go. We have extras for the background. Around 376 total yards receiving. He had, I believe it was 15 of his total receptions in the last 5 games. And that was 2 of his touchdowns as well. And around 226 or 276 yards in those 5 games as well. Now, those were your biggest games, right? Like, so it's huge. Like Vandy, Mizzou, Clemson, the bowl game, like that's when you want your best players to shine brightest. But a lot of times it felt like you're kind of looking around for like who's going to be the guy that steps up. I thought this receiving core took a massive step forward the weekend of the Alabama game, like just a huge step forward. We knew that Josh Simon was going to be great, and he played like phenomenal football all season long for your tight end. But you were a little bit banged up at times at receiver. You were young. Mazio Bennett took a while. Like there was people that you could plug and play, and it seemed like, especially later in the season, there was a different hero sometimes every week. Campbell against Mizzou, massive game and huge clutch moments. So I have zero doubt that somebody's going to step up. The question now becomes, can you keep Lenore Sellers upright enough throughout the year to get this thing rolling to where it needs to be? I don't think you have to be an offensive line that only gives up 20 sacks in a season. I don't, especially with who you have at quarterback. I think this can look a lot like the teams you saw, like Alabama had in 2021 with Bryce Young, where they gave up, I'll look it up. Let me pull this up real quick. Alabama had at the time, a program high 41 sacks. So the same that you allowed last year. That shows you that it's possible. Now, they were also doing that in 15 games, whereas South Carolina did it in 12 and 13, respectively. But you saw the same thing with Milroe. You've seen it before with different, not Georgia necessarily, but like Ole Miss struggled up front at times. Texas last year, Texas was 100th or worse in sacks allowed, and they have multiple guys who are going to get drafted, including one of the best tackles in the country. That 2019 LSU team, though, is the last team to win a national championship and allowing over 20 sacks. They allowed 37 in 2015, and I am not going to compare anyone to 2019 LSU. I'm not. But the way that team was in pieces offensively is what this team can try to look like. You've got a mobile quarterback that has a clutch gene and is at his best when like the lights shine brightest. You've got a lot of good receivers. Now, you don't have Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson, right? But you have an absolute nightmare mismatch and athletic freak in Nick Harbor and all of the other guys that you bring along. And the thing that we keep talking about that they haven't had on this roster in quite some time. Definitely not last year. Definitely not, I feel like, in the last 5 years. Size. We talked about going into last year in spring camp or in fall camp, and you had 12 or 13 players at that position listed on the roster. Only 4 of them were over 6'1.5" or 6'2". That is not the same now. You have over 2/3 of the players at that position that are at least 6'1", over 6 feet tall, and you no longer have like the small gadget type guys that you'd be running like hopefully they can get open across the middle or something like that. You no longer have that. You have size everywhere here. So how do you figure out a way to you don't have to cut that number in half and get down to 20, but how do you get 5 less? How do you get 5 to 10 sacks less on the season? And how do you make sure you do it in big games? So when you're playing in Ole Miss, you're not constantly under duress. If you're playing Alabama, Oklahoma, you're not constantly under duress. People forget that Oklahoma game, South Carolina had 9 sacks in that game, and it was over within the first quarter. They also allowed like 7 in that game. So that's one of my biggest questions going into spring and also next year. Obviously, is the offensive line going to be good enough to not limit the rest of the pieces they have in place that I think are good enough to go at least compete for a title conference-wise and the college football playoff? All right, that is all for the first part of the show. Make sure you stay tuned. We're going to talk about a lot of other stuff, including the horrible injury to Southern Cal's Juju Watkins. How does that impact South Carolina's run to another potential title? And we also talk a little bit of softball, as another win and notch on the belt against the in-state rival Clemson Tigers was won on Tuesday night. Locked on Gamecocks continues right after this. All right, before we get into the next segment, I want to give a quick shout out to our friends at Supply House. You guys have heard me talk about Supply House before. You're going to hear me talk about them again. And that is because Supply House offers something that almost no one else does. You get supplies you need from the site made for the skilled trades at Supply House. Whether you're in plumbing, HVAC, or electrical work, Supply House is the reliable way to order products online. Their easy-to-use website is packed with helpful resources and the latest product info to help you get the job done right. Plus, with a complete inventory of over 200,000 parts from 400 plus top brands, you'll find exactly what you need delivered fast from coast to coast. Need help with an order? Supply House offers expert support and industry-leading service, so you'll always talk to a real person. And for the trade pros looking for an extra edge, their free Trade Master program offers exclusive perks like a dedicated phone line, free shipping, and discounts on every order. Thousands of skilled professionals are already taking advantage. Now it's your turn. Join the Trade Master program today at supplyhouse.com/TM and start ordering plumbing, HVAC, and electrical supplies with just a few clicks. Plus, use promo code SH5 for 5% off your first order. That's supplyhouse.com. All right, let's get back into the show. And I want to get back to more stuff from spring camp. And obviously, there's a lot. There's been multiple practices that have already happened. And most of the news seems to be consistent with what you were hoping for and expected. Great start to spring camp from the young guys at receiver. A little bit of struggles from up front. A lot of the main guys and core pieces, like foundational pieces of this program, and I mean like Dylan Stewart, obviously Nick Harbor, we mentioned earlier, Lenoris, like those guys have looked very, very good, very, very crisp going into spring camp. Now, I don't know what that means necessarily in terms of how great of a season they're going to have next year. Like Dylan Stewart is one of the best defensive ends and edge rushers in the country. I would imagine his sacks might be around the same number they were a year ago because he's probably not going to have only one guy blocking him every single time the ball snapped. That being said, like how much more or how much higher is the ceiling for Lenore Sellers over 12 to 13, maybe hopefully more in that amount of games versus what he played last year, including the injury and his slow start? I say all that to say those are all things that are good news that you probably shouldn't take for granted, but also what you expected. The issues on the interior defensive line, we'll talk about that in a second. So before we get into like the negative part, I do want to reiterate just what's been said around camp with the young receivers and the freshman receivers specifically. Now, listen, you signed 5 guys. You signed 5 guys in last year's class. It felt like they were going to stop at 4. And obviously you're not going to turn down a guy like Donovan Murph. You're not going to turn down Malik Clark, Alexi, or something like that. You also have Jordan Gidron, Brian Rowe Jr., and Jaden Sellers. So I actually know 5 of them have been enrolled since January. You signed 6 in the class. My mistake. Murph will join after he graduates because he is one of the very few in the handful of players that didn't enroll early. We talked about that last year as well. Out of the 24 players you signed a year ago, 21 of them were early enrollees. Similar numbers this year going into spring camp, which is huge. Now, talking about the strengths and what they've been able to do. Obviously, Mike Ferry coming in year 2 as a coach and assistant on the staff, phenomenal job at recruiting. I think way better than any of us could have expected, especially with his ties in the Northeast. He was incredible getting a couple of those kids, not just in-state or Southeastern guys, like from around the country. But him talking about the young guys, the thing he keeps coming back to is not the physical size or their athletic ability. It is how smart and savvy they are beyond their years already. That's huge. That's huge. It's like one of the most frustrating things about, like, you think about like a highly ranked running back, a highly ranked, even if it's an offensive lineman or anything like that. One of the things that you have to do, not just on the offensive line, but to get on the field, especially at like you're early in your career, is the little things. You got to learn how to block. You got to learn the technique to block. You got to be willing to block, right? Like running backs, there's been how many 5-star running backs that can't see the field across the country or across the SEC because they don't want to stick their nose in a linebacker's chest when he's coming full speed coming after the quarterback. Those are the kind of things that will get you on the field early in your career. And the same goes for receivers. Like being able to be in the moment, not just knowing the playbook, not just knowing your routes, all that kind of stuff, but knowing the routes of all of your teammates, understanding the route concepts and the tree that you're running and why against which defenses and why it works. Figuring out where like the soft spot in the zone is if you're running an intermediate route, all of those things. But having that in addition to the physical components, massive job being ahead of the curve. Best way I know to put it. The quote here I got from Purdy, they all have a lot of things in common. They all have the ball skills. They all have the big catch radius. I would say all of them can run pretty well. Every one of them can run well. Brian Rowe is pretty explosive when you look at his 40 or 41-inch vert already as a freshman. That's insane. I think he had 2 weeks ago when they were going through spring camp and workouts. Lex Cyrus gets in there. He breaks the school record. Hasn't even stepped on the field yet. That's obviously massive. So I think the thing that's, I don't know the other word to use than scariest, especially for opponents, about this group of players, this is one of the big things that's been holding you back. You've always had a guy, right? You've always had like a guy. And a lot of times you had a guy when you didn't expect who that person was going to be or who was going to like take that position or role going into the season. Josh Van's a guy like that, right? Xavier Legette, like a lot of promise, a lot of upside, didn't realize he was going to go off for over 1,200 yards, right? You've always been able to find a guy to have really good seasons and be like the main guy. The supporting cast is the next iteration of how you build an offense and like be able to recruit better, perform better, and then also have like more options, right? So the scary part for other teams is like, I would love if Nick Harbor balls out. I would love if he balls out and ends up getting like, in the NFL draft. Same with the Norse. I think it's more likely than not that only one of them is leaving early for the NFL draft next year, right? So you have this level of physical ability and this level of like understanding of what you're trying to do, because South Carolina's offense is going to be different than it was a year ago, even though it'll try to be as similar as possible, if that makes sense. Dowell Loggins obviously gone. Mike Shula comes in. I'm not going to sit here and like freak out about the bowl game performance and think that that's exactly how the offense is going to look. I do hope that going into next year, you don't have the same slow start where it took 6 games to kind of figure out. Pepper was obviously creating some bad memories for even her. She's growling. But if you can come out and that entire unit can be not elite, but be as deep as you think it could be, and they understand what you're trying to do immediately. And then listen, especially freshmen, but there's going to be mistakes. There's going to be drop balls. There's going to be, someone's going to run the wrong route. Same thing with running back. Like at some point, someone's going to run the wrong direction, whatever. Limiting those kind of early freshman mistakes, that is, I think, how you get over the hump. Because if you look again, the tale of 2 seasons from last year, the second half of the year versus the first half of the year, everything felt crisp, understood, and like confidence with what they were trying to run and what they were doing. It didn't feel like they were trying to feel things out. It didn't feel like they were completely overmatched. It felt like they had an exact understanding of not only what they wanted to do, but their identity. And if you can get the freshmen at that position to buy into that immediately, God, that's huge. Huge, huge. Okay, well, with all of that positive stuff, we're not going to get into the negatives of the interior defensive line. We'll save that for tomorrow in tomorrow's episode. Now, before we close out, we have a quick word from one of our newest sponsors. And when we come back, we're going to talk about yet another win South Carolina had over Clemson. And I think the fifth or sixth main sport this season. I believe it's only baseball. But we'll talk about that next. Locked on Gamecocks continues right after this. All right, so before we get into the last part of the show, I do want to give a quick shout out to our friends at Monarch Money. Monarch Money back again. Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? Between dining out, online shopping, entertainment, it is easy to lose track, and that's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app, it's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So you stop just managing your money and start building wealth. Listen, when I started using Monarch, I realized just how much I was spending on food delivery. That's a big one. I'm getting violent nods over here from the GF. And now I budget smarter and save more. Instead of juggling multiple apps, you could use Monarch to check your finances, track spending, and even plan long-term goals. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONCollege at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONCollege for half off your first year. All right, we close out today's show with another win over Clemson. Obviously, the baseball series did not go as we had hoped, but with I believe it was a 6-0 win for South Carolina softball, which maybe we did start talking about that. Let me know in the comments if you guys want more softball content, because the SEC is obviously always very, very good and competitive in softball, but South Carolina is a top 10 team as of today. So they had their midweek game against Clemson. It was at home. They won 6-0. That means you now have wins over Clemson in football, men's basketball, women's basketball, volleyball, softball, and hockey. We just get baseball there. It's over. So also keep in mind, you get football at home next year. Women's basketball is not going anywhere. And it looks like the softball team is like very, very good. I mean, that's a Clemson team that was not a bad team. I think they were like 24-6 or 25-6 or 24-10 maybe. Usually softball plays a lot more games. But anyway, either way, very impressive. Another dub for South Carolina over Clemson. Yeah, and anytime you can use the our state graphic, it's a thumbs up for me. So that is all for today's show. Make sure you tune in tomorrow. We will talk about the weekend series preview for baseball against Tennessee, as well as a preview for the women's basketball team going to play Maryland, and then the winner of, I believe, Duke or is it Duke or West Virginia, or Duke in North Carolina. So all things pointing to a positive weekend. I don't want to jinx it, but that gets started on Friday at 4 p.m. against Maryland. They are coming off a double overtime, probably the game of the tournament. Second highest scoring tournament game since 1995 against Alabama. I think they won like 111-108 in double overtime. So we will talk about all that and more on tomorrow's episode. Y'all have a great night. Go Cox.